There's an epidemic sweeping the nation. It's not the flu, it isn't COVID, isn't a virus, isn't a bacterium. It's an idea, a festering malignancy that burrows into the minds of the unsuspecting. The year is 1980, and the world is quickly changing, lurching forwards toward a new millennium. With it, fear, that ancient companion of humanity, has found new life. Long-held, deep-seated, yet nebulous anxieties are being confirmed and solidified in homes across America as people learn that their country is infested with a secret satanic cult dedicated to abusing children for malefic purposes. The cultists wear masks of normalcy. They are your friendly neighbor, the kindly librarian, the unassuming schoolteacher. They bag groceries, teach preschoolers their ABCs, and exchange pleasantries over white picket fences just like any other decent, God-fearing Americans. But behind those facades lurks a dark truth, one where innocence is sacrificed, where children become pawns. Books and memoirs spill forth as if a dam has finally broken, written by victims who managed to escape the cult's clutches, recounting horrors too terrible for daylight. Experts decipher symbols etched in blood, teaching law enforcement officers to recognize the telltale signs of satanic worship. Newspapers scream their provocative headlines, and television screens broadcast gut-wrenching stories of bloody child sacrifice. The contagion spreads on. It seeps into cinema, television, comics, and novels, metastasizing until it becomes truly mainstream and unkillable. The nation quakes. Doors are deadbolted, windows shuttered. Except there's just one teeny tiny little problem, a little plot hole in this vast conspiracy.
It's false. It's a fake. It's an urban legend that never happened. We made this one up. It's fiction.
There was no underground nationwide cult dedicated to Satan. There aren't seances or summonings taking place in the basements of otherwise normal neighborhoods. Though there is a satanic church, actual members don't even believe in their namesake. No children were being ritualistically sacrificed. They weren't being abused or murdered, at least not any more than is unfortunately normal, and certainly not by a secretive, black-hooded cabal. The harrowing accounts, such as the infamous Michelle Remembers, were almost immediately debunked as total fabrications by people looking to cash in on the average American's anxiety. The so-called experts were just normal people who learned about satanic symbols at their local library. Yet, despite the overwhelming preponderance of evidence against it, the contagion never truly died. After a decade infesting the hearts and minds of Americans, it merely went into its dormant stage. It was retroactively labeled Satanic Panic, and most Americans could look back and shakily laugh at the ignorance that it coaxed out. Still, the fears persisted, finding its home in media as writers, producers, and the like saw easy potential for drama and cheap thrills in the story.
Evidence shows music laced with satanic overtones has played an important role in the lives of many of the teenagers who have been convicted of satanic killings.
Though there aren't any mask panics today surrounding heavy metal music or Dungeons & Dragons games like there were back in the 80s, the echoes of those fears are absolutely still around. And even then, there are other movements that have taken the satanic panic of yesteryear and run with it. Look no further than QAnon, Pizzagate, and the other right-wing conspiracies that took root a few years ago. It was the same story, only the characters shifted. The villains are no longer our next-door neighbors, and it was no longer ritualistic sacrifice, or at least not only that, but instead the siphoning of their blood to extract adrenochrome, or something. These were the thoughts running through my head in the theater when my wife and I were watching Longlegs. Don't judge me. Spoiler warning for anyone who hasn't seen it yet, and I do recommend doing so. Now's your last chance to get away before you get swept up in the panic.
Hail Satan!
The movie is an unsubtle throwback to the late 70s and early 80s, and this very fear of ritualistic satanic killings. Flashbacks of our protagonist, Agent Lee Harker, are set in that time, shown to us through a frame with a tightened aspect ratio and rounded corners, evoking the look of a Super 8 camera. It follows, pun intended, her as she unravels the mysterious killings claimed by the elusive Longlegs. As the veil is slowly lifted, we discover that the gruesome murders committed by the fathers within these families trace back to innocuous birthday gifts in the form of dolls. These seemingly harmless playthings harbor a sinister secret, infused with satanic mind control magic. The film, though truly unsettling and terrifying, isn't exactly breaking new ground with its premise. By the year of our Lord 2024, there's an absolute mountain of media that explores the occult. Rosemary's Baby, The Wicker Man, The Omen, The Exorcist, Stigmata, Midsummer, End of Days, Deadly Blessing, The Mephisto Waltz, We Summon the Darkness, The Empty Man, American Horror Story, True Detective Season 1, Yellow Jackets, Brand New Cherry Flavor, and those are just the ones that I could rattle off while I was writing this script. And with all of that, the average American has an understanding of the general tropes, shorthands, and other commonalities that the writers and directors can pull from. We have these images in our heads of what evil looks like, and that was shaped almost entirely by the media we consumed. So, after wrapping up Longlegs, I picked up a graphic novel called The Department of Truth. Imagine my surprise when I discovered it dives headfirst into the Satanic Panic as well. Was I shocked? Mildly. Should I have been? Probably not. Regardless, at that point, the decision for my next video was out of my hands. It was practically written in the stars. So, how much time do you have? Because, see, the historical context that leads up to our story is long and Byzantine. I love that word. There is no singular universal cause. Instead, many different religious, governmental, economic, and social circumstances conspired together to rise up and come crashing back down as this tsunami of anti-satanic fervor.
It's a culmination of superstition and scapegoating that goes back 1,000 years, maybe more. There are different instances you can point to, but it all really starts to spread in Europe in the Middle Ages after the turn of the first millennium. Rome has fallen and the Roman Catholic Church rises in its place to become the organizing principle of Europe. They unite all these warring kingdoms under a singular faith. They adopt some useful traditions and festivals of the old pagan religions. But they round up other beliefs and bind them all together, creating a pastiche of paganism that they combine with loose bits of scripture and call the end result Satan. They effectively create hell as a punishment to push people to convert to Christianity. If the heathens keep to their pagan ways, they will be condemned to the lake of eternal fire. This new Christian vision of hell is a powerful idea, and it spreads all through Europe. Since people want to prove they are devout, they begin to fear ideas that might condemn them to eternal damnation. And so a deep fear of people of other faiths grips Europe. The pagans are painted with the brush of witchcraft and devil worship, but it's worse with the Jews. They lived in communities all over Europe, keeping to their faith and their ancient rituals, what seemed arcane and mysterious to the Christian populations. Now, the next bit isn't proven by any historical means, just a supposition based on the limited sources from the time. After the First Crusade, some of the fighters came back from the Holy Land with rumors, stories of Jews who killed themselves and their children rather than being forcibly converted to Christianity. In time, the rumor, which was probably never true to begin with, loses its context. It becomes a game of telephone twisted by prejudice and a fear of hell. That ended in the most common form of what would become known as the blood libel, the belief that Jews baked their matzah bread with the blood of Christian babies. And so when a child would be found dead by mysterious means, the local Christians would point their fingers towards the insular Jewish communities and kill the ones they believed to be responsible. Those are the two corrosive threads of thought that weave together through the last 1,000 years of Western civilization. It all boils down to two very human instincts: fear of outsiders and a drive to protect our children.
That's exactly what Longlegs is about, at least according to director Osgood Perkins. The movie opens with that vintage Super 8 film look as we first meet Lee Harker as a young girl. It's also here that we first meet Longlegs, the eponymous serial killer played by Nicolas Cage, in a way that really rides the line between terrifyingly insane and just complete camp.
Oh, there she is. The almost birthday girl.
The scene where Harker meets Longlegs is shot from a low angle. We are seeing things from the perspective of a young girl, unaware of what's going on, unaware of the danger she's actually in. Longlegs' face is cut off by the frame, as if the girl just can't see up that far.
It seems I wore my long legs today.
We later learned that Lee's mother filed a police report on the event in order to protect her daughter. Of course, that protection required much more from her, as we'd find out later. In an interview with Big Picture Podcast, Perkins describes the story of the serial killer being a sleight of hand to get the viewer invested into the actual story of a mother trying to protect her child from the bad world and all of its evils.
Ruth Harker, the mom, she kind of makes a dead tough choice. You know, either this is going to happen or this is going to happen. And she chooses protecting her kid. Is that wrong? Of course it's not wrong. Any of us would do it. Right? It's like you're given that, I guess a bunch of people are going to die, but she's not going to die. It's kind of elemental, right? It's kind of primal.
So, the stage is set for the stage to be set. The history of the Satanic Panic, as it were. But zooming in on the last half of the last century, a lot changed very quickly, and sudden massive change always inevitably leads to fear and backlash. Case in point, look at the massive shift in media over the last 10 to 15 years towards more progressive ideals and all the reactionaries trying to gain back ground by, I don't know, blowing up cases of Bud Light or something.
Grandpa's feeling a little frisky today.
The anti-war movement of the 60s didn't just open a rabbit hole, it unleashed a whole warren of countercultural escapades. The Summer of Love, Civil Rights, Malcolm X and the Black Panthers, Stonewall, and a surge of new religious movements, NRMs, that were often just cults in disguise. Think the Manson family, Heaven's Gate, Jonestown, Children of God, and Rajneesh. Even the relatively benign groups like Transcendental Meditation, Hare Krishna movement, and the Church of Satan were viewed with the same suspicion those medieval European Christians reserved for the Jews. To say they were deeply distrusted is like saying Henry Cavill is kinda handsome. Like saying January 6th was a bit of a kerfuffle. Paganism was equated with Satanism by early Christianity, and that paranoia passed down the generations was so intense against these NRMs that parents of converts often turned to anti-cult crusaders like Ted Patrick, the notorious father of deprogramming, despite his reputation. Patrick's methods were anything but gentle, involving kidnapping, prolonged false imprisonment, isolation, beatings, starvation, and sexual assault, all in a zealous bid to deconvert the client's children. And let's not brush over the founding of the Satanic Church itself. Founded in 1966 by Anton LaVey, the church was more of an organized set of atheistic principles and philosophies than an actual religion. Dude basically read some Ayn Rand and decided to put an even more melodramatic twist on libertarianism, which is to say that despite its name, members of the Church of Satan do not actually believe in the devil as a literal being that exists. According to High Priest Peter Gilmore,
to the Satanist, he is his own god. Satan is a symbol of man living as his prideful carnal nature dictates. Some Satanists extend this symbol to encompass the evolutionary force of entropy that permeates all of nature and provides the drive for survival and propagation inherent in all living things. To Satanists, Satan is not a conscious entity to be worshipped. Rather, it is a name for the reservoir of power inside each human to be tapped at will.
Yet, despite everything that the church proclaims, no matter how loud its members shout their beliefs, the average good Christian American sees Church of Satan and thinks devil worship. Which, understandable, since the name and the symbolism. But even once it's been explained, many, especially in the older generations, see it with distrust. Don't believe me? Tell your religious parents that you're planning on converting to the Satanic Temple and watch their reactions. It was only 2 years later, in 1968, that one of the earliest and certainly most well-known piece of media on satanic cults, Rosemary's Baby, was released and likely put the idea in many Americans' minds that there may be satanic cults all around them, in hiding, waiting to snatch up their babies and perform arcane blood rituals on them. Even if people didn't truly believe that to be a possibility at the time, the idea was implanted and would sit there, dormant, until... The 80s were a wild ride. everyone emerging from their decade-long coke binge like bears from hibernation and collectively deciding to compensate by going all out. Big hair, because why settle for a coif when your hairdo can defy gravity itself?
That's why her hair is so big, it's full of secrets.
Big music, with hooks so catchy they'll reel you in like a big fish on a synth line. Not to be confused with Real Big Fish. We're a decade too early for ska. And credit cards? Sell out. They were swiped with the reckless abandon of a squirrel raiding a nut buffet, which, by the way, would be a great band name. Better than Real Big Fish, anyway.
Big mistake. Big.
Amidst it all, monumental shifts in morality and plays for the souls of Americans loomed large. The character of Longlegs is inextricably linked to this era. It's never mentioned in the film directly, but his design is that of a person who was once this hip, wannabe glam rocker of the 70s, from the white leather jacket to the poorly applied white facial makeup, to the graying, voluminous, curly hair. Of course, Longlegs was eventually visited by that inexorable beast who comes for us all, time, and it did not treat him well. His face is horribly disfigured by botched plastic surgeries. In fact, it looks very much like a mask a la Mike Myers. It has that very specific look of 80s-era plastic surgeries from disreputable doctors, as if he had gone from surgeon to surgeon trying to fix what the previous one had ruined, but instead making it worse. Think Joan Rivers or Mickey Rourke. Of course, the film adds in a more fantastical symbol of this time catching up to him, and his response to it. He makes a deal with the man downstairs to remain young. It's just one example of the film using defamiliarization, the act of taking something mundane or relatable and exaggerating beyond its realistic bounds in order to gain a new perspective or make the subject more entertaining. His obsession with eternal youth led him to walk a literal path to hell, one that his real-world counterparts were accused of. Coming out of the stagflation era of the 70s and 2 recessions to kick off the 80s, the economy finally made a turnaround and experienced some pretty staggering growth during Reagan's term from 81 to 89. Whether you side with the Reaganomics crowd and think that it was the cutting of corporate taxes that was the key, or you are correct and side with the Keynesians pointing to monetary policy and deficit spending, the boom itself is undeniable. Unemployment was down, inflation was finally back down. It seemed like we'd finally re-entered a period of growth of the magnitude not seen since before Vietnam. Despite the bump, though, tensions were brewing in the States due to some unprecedented circumstances rearing up. First up, part of the reason for the lower unemployment numbers was the rise of dual-income families. From 1970 to 1990, the percentage of dual-income households jumped from just under 50% to nearly 70%. With more parents spending more time away from their kids, their anxieties had plenty of room to fester and grow, just waiting for a spark to ignite mass paranoia. And boy, there were sparks aplenty. The non-response to AIDS unleashed a tidal wave of misinformation, leading many parents terrified that even being near someone with the disease could infect their child. The advent of the milk carton kids, while not exactly a success in finding kidnapped children, did a stellar job at making parents fear that their child might be pictured next. The rise of serial killers in the 70s peaking in the 80s, with infamous names like Dahmer, the Night Stalker, and the Sunset Strip killers. And then there's the general uptick in violent crime throughout the 80s, which peaked and then mysteriously plummeted in the 90s. Also in the 80s and 90s, evangelicalism and Christian fundamentalism in general made a grand comeback, as many conservative religious leaders felt the nation was sliding into a pit of hedonism and depravity. This was part of a broader pushback against the seismic societal shifts we discussed already, and it aimed to drag the country back to the good old days of the 50s. Ironically, those ideals were themselves a reaction to women's newfound independence when they joined the workforce during World War II. One of the most notable movements was the Moral Majority, led by Baptist minister Jerry Falwell. To give you a flavor of this crowd, one founding member described it as an effort to reclaim the religious right, which he dubbed a sham, controlled by 3 Catholics and a Jew. The moral majority was the first to successfully wield the traditional family values dog whistle, rallying against anything they found abhorrent, mainly against anything with even a whiff of LGBT community, abortion, women's rights, and possibly the most cartoonishly evil of the lot, opposition to the SALT nuclear non-proliferation talks between the US and Russia. I guess they thought Jesus wanted more nukes. Yet despite the extremity of these beliefs, they managed to gain a footing in America and Canada, thanks to the conditions we discussed above.
And I really believe that the pagans and the abortionists and the feminists and the gays and the lesbians who are actively trying to make that an alternative lifestyle, the ACLU, People for the American Way, all of them who tried to secularize America, I point the finger in their face and say, you helped this happen.
Grandpa's feeling a little frisky today.
All of this fear and paranoia led to a large portion of the straight, white, Christianity-inclined population looking for answers as to why crime was up, why there were so many serial killers, why a disease that seemingly targeted the gay community was sweeping the nation. Naturally, they blamed it on the audacity of people flaunting their true selves, the humanity. Point is, there was no shortage of things for the average American parent to be frightened about, or crises for leaders to take advantage of by smuggling in their own fundamentalist views. Add a media industry desperate for attention as an accelerant, and send both parents from home all day to simmer in these fears, and you've got yourself a wildfire ready to be lit. Or, as grifters might say, jackpot. So picture this. The dominoes were lined up, and in 1980, they began to topple one by one like a slow-motion disaster movie. Enter Dr. Lawrence Pazder, a psychiatrist with a flair for the dramatic, and his former patient turned wife, and totally not as an abuse of the mental health professional's relationship with his patient, Michelle Smith. Together, they unleashed a memoir that read like a horror novel, detailing Michelle's alleged abuse by a shadowy satanic cult. The book, partially funded by the Catholic Church, would eventually go on to become a bestseller, translated into 20 languages and sold all over the world to great success for the publisher and the writers. Michelle initially sought Dr. Pazder's help for what seemed like run-of-the-mill postpartum depression in the 70s. But things took a sharp left turn into the realm of recovered memory therapy. If you've ever binged-watched a thriller, then you've seen this trope. Doctor hypnotizes patient to recover buried memories. Despite its Hollywood appeal, though, this technique, along with the whole concept of repressed traumatic memories, has been pretty much debunked by experts worldwide. These methods often serve as a way for the psychiatrist to, intentionally or not, plant false memories in the patient's mind, rather than recover real ones. It's like those marathon police interrogations where leading questions nudge the suspect towards a confession, where the result is only a tangled web of fiction masquerading as fact.
We already know. He's obviously not holding anything back from you. He had you come over to see this.
Come on. Something with the head. What else did you guys do?
Just like with Michelle's supposed repressed memories, Agent Harker had buried her own childhood encounter with Longlegs. Her mother, Ruth, facilitated this repression and secretly abetted Longlegs in his satanic killing spree, mirroring the accusation hurled at parents during the panic. In a twisted sense, Longlegs serves as the father figure in this bizarre family dynamic alongside Harker and Ruth. Near the film's climax, it's revealed that Longlegs had been residing in Lee's old home since their first encounter years ago. He represents an exaggerated version of an estranged, distant father, with the family dynamic reflecting a secret that strains their bond to the breaking point. It's also likely the reason she was special, the Harker announcing the devil's arrival, and so Longlegs himself assumes the role of the father, literally the man downstairs. The serial killings are meticulously ritualistic, akin to those alleged in the real-world scenarios. Birthdays are the common thread. Each family targeted by Longlegs has a daughter with a birthday on the 14th of a specific month, and the murders occur within 6 days of that birthday, either before or after, forming a satanic symbol, an inverted triangle, when plotted on a calendar. Triangle, 3 points, mother, father, daughter. The murders are pretty convoluted, though. Longlegs crafts a doll representing the daughter, containing a magical metal ball. Ruth delivers this doll to the family on the daughter's birthday, and the magic within takes some sort of control over the father, compelling him to murder his family. While the specifics of the plan are less crucial, the emphasis on birthdays is meaningful here.
Oh, there she is. The almost birthday girl.
Side note, once the plan was uncovered, did no one think to warn Lee's boss, whose family perfectly fits Longlegs' criteria?
Would you like to join me in the kitchen, honey?
I'm so sorry. I'll be right back.
No, I'll be right back. You'll still be in the kitchen.
Reflecting on Perkins' comments earlier, if the movie is about parents keeping secrets from their children, then birthdays symbolize that moment children are deemed old enough to uncover these secrets, a shorthand for time passing, moving from one age to the next. However, due to Ruth's pact with Longlegs, and by extension the man downstairs, the truth was withheld from Lee throughout her life. Her memories remained repressed until they violently resurfaced when she destroyed her doll at the end, finally breaking the hypnosis. While there's really no way to know for certain whether Dr. Pazder intentionally led Michelle Smith to her supposed repressed memories of cult abuse, there is a mountain of evidence that, unlike Agent Harker, Michelle's memories were fabricated whole cloth.
Did you recall anything about animal or human sacrifices?
They sacrificed animals, and they used fetuses of babies in their ceremonies.
Over the course of 600 hours under hypnosis, yes, you heard that right, 600 hours including sessions where she supposedly regressed back to 5 years old, Michelle revealed that her parents were card-carrying members of a satanic cult in the quaint hometown of Victoria, British Columbia.
Well, they're a secret organization, they're a secret society. A secret society does not reveal the identity of the people or the ways of their practices.
According to Pazder and Smith, the cult predated Christianity itself by several centuries. Now, let's pause for a moment. This is where any rational reader of Michelle Remembers might put down the book, rub their temples, and move on with their life. It reads like a plot ripped from a pulpy alternate history novel. How could such an organization predate the very church it supposedly opposes? And how did it manage to stay completely under the radar through centuries of religious purges and inquisitions? The mind boggles. Of course, Pazder later retracted that claim. Yet people believed it, and some still do. Though many have caught on to the book as either a work of fiction or the foggy recollection of a more mundane abuse suffered at a young age, a quick glance at the Amazon reviews shows that even after 40 years and countless debunkings, there are still true believers out there. It's a testament to the enduring power of sensationalism in popular media.
A very challenging book to read, but worth it. I believe that Michelle had the experiences she claims to have had here. I have no doubt she received heavenly...
Michelle's story is so typical of what has been going on from the days of Cain and Abel. Our world is in the process of finding the truths about these crimes against children. Many won't be able to bear the truth of
Very interesting read. It's totally believable, and the controversy surrounding this is understandable.
I don't know why anyone would doubt this book. It is written, in my opinion, with complete honesty. I have no doubt that there are negative forces in Victoria and that Michelle's encounter was real.
Read this book.
The ancient age of the satanic cult wasn't the only bonkers claim made by the duo. According to them, the rituals often summoned actual demons, with one session in particular hosting the who's who of the afterlife, with such attendees as Jesus, the Virgin Mary, Archangel Michael, and even the D-Man himself.
Ma mère?
Ma mère.
The Virgin Mary?
That's right.
How old were you when you had the vision?
5 years old. I didn't know who that was at 5. All I knew was this was the first person that had come along in 10 months.
When asked about whether or not it mattered that these wild allegations weren't at all accurate, or if it was simply important that Michelle believed them, Dr. Pazder's response was, well...
It is a real experience. If you talk to Michelle today, she will say, that's what I remember. We still leave the question open. For her, it was very real. We are all eager to prove or disprove what happened, but at the end, it doesn't matter.
This is what I have done as a psychiatrist. I'm not an investigative reporter, but as a psychiatrist, what I did convinced me that this was in fact a reality for Michelle. People can pick that up and take their own journey with it and see what they conclude. That's very important.
Which is absolute insano-town. Leaving the question open to discussion and further probing is one thing when the sessions are private, as they are supposed to be, but not doing that due diligence prior to publishing their findings for the world to read is an entirely different matter. The word irresponsible is not strong enough. And as expected, almost immediately after the release of Michelle Remembers, Smith and Pazder's tale come under scrutiny. The same year it was published, Michelle Smith's father, Jack Proby, along with other neighbors and family friends, were interviewed and all denied the allegations against Jack and Michelle's mother.
It was the worst bag of lies a little girl could ever make up. The book took me 4 months to read and I cried all the time. I kept saying to myself, "Dear God, how could anyone do this to their dead mother?"
The interviews were published as part of a multi-issue investigation by the Mail on Sunday newspaper in the UK. Unfortunately for us all, the piece largely went unnoticed, as did other contemporary debunkings. It wasn't really until the 90s that serious scrutiny was given to the accounts by the mainstream. In the meantime, satanic ritual abuse, SRA, was the hot-button word that almost guaranteed ratings. It was the neon 80s version of DEI, CRT, or woke. The fervor around the book spawned numerous copycat memoirs, like 1991's Satan's Underground, or ones from supposed ex-priests of the cult, like Mike Warnke's The Satan Seller. The latter really tickled the fancies of the religious right because it was written as a confession of a born-again Christian, throwing off the sins of the past. Just like Pazder and Smith, the book made Warnke famous, especially in evangelical circles where he was often a guest speaker at conferences. Dr. Pazder's credibility was propped up through the 80s, as he was often interviewed by otherwise serious outlets like 2020, which failed to properly interrogate his claims. He was even used as a consultant in criminal trials against suspected cultists.
It's not a witch hunt anyway. It's merely to let people know that in the incidences where it does happen, not to make everyone paranoid.
By the end of the 80s, much of his time was spent consulting on SRA cases, and the book itself was used as a primary source for training of law enforcement. Take a moment to really internalize that. A memoir that includes actual corporeal cameos of Satan and the Virgin Mary was treated as a textbook for police, child counselors, and other officials on how to investigate possible sexual abuse. What the fuck? Since we're already going down this road, Longlegs can also be viewed through the lens of childhood sexual assault. What is my channel? Though there aren't any literal acts of sexual violence in the film, there are quite a few hints that suggest a deeper, more disturbing narrative. Stripped to the studs, we could say that the movie is about how Lee's mom invited a child predator to live with them through the latter half of her childhood. This is a middle-aged man targeting little girls with very clear pedophilic undertones. Ruth, and Oz Perkins himself, want us to believe that she was trying to protect Lee, but what she really did was enable a predator. It seems inconceivable that Longlegs lived with them for so long without ever interacting with Lee. Indeed, when she looks at the basement door in Ruth's house, it's very clear that Lee knows something is off, even if she doesn't remember exactly what that is. There are red flashes of snakes, symbols often associated with evil, and a flashback to Lee's childhood when Ruth began lying to her. Clearly, the girl knew something was up, even then. We're left to wonder what might have happened to Lee, what she actually knew. But it's clear that whatever it was bad enough to repress. Lee's doll, a representation of her as a child, contained that memory of abuse, buried deep within as a metal ball. This observation, credited to Reddit user That Jewish Feminist, nice name, highlights the chilling and intimate nature of the trauma Lee experienced. Of note is the fact that other than Ruth, Longlegs works alone. He isn't part of some wider cult, at least as far as we know. Contrast this with the nationwide hysteria of the Satanic Panic and the fear of a widespread organized cult preying on children. The choice makes Longlegs' killings and his implied abuse of Lee that much more personal and insidious. Cults are more detached and can easily stray into camp if the director isn't careful, so it was a good choice in my book.
Over the last 8 years, I have evaluated 700 plus and supervised 500 plus cases of alleged sexual abuse for forensic purposes. Out of all of these cases, only one sex offender was engaged in satanic activities, but his offenses seemed to be independent brutal assaults.
Only a few months after the release of Michelle Remembers, the Satanic Panic was already underway. What started as a gruesome but non-satanic case of child sexual abuse very quickly blew up into an absolute frenzy in Bakersfield, California. It had been confirmed by a doctor that 2 girls, Becky and Dawn McEwen, had been abused by their grandfather. However, the list of accused quickly changed and grew after social workers involved with the case returned from a seminar that seems to have been inspired by Michelle Remembers. In his book on the current cases, Edward Humes writes,
"The satanic investigation began with one child, who had been interviewed many times over a 10-month period without ever mentioning anything about ritual abuse or bad churches. But shortly after, several Kern County social workers returned from a training seminar that hyped devil worship as a major element in child molestation. This girl began speaking of it during the now familiar suggestive interviews that were standard practice at the time. In short order, other victims began spouting similar stories, never mentioned in earlier interviews.
By the time the dust had settled in 1986, 5 other cases of supposed ritualistic abuse had been tried, with at least 36 convictions resulting in serious prison time for many of them, including Becky and Dawn's own parents, who were in prison for 12 years before being exonerated. No physical evidence was ever found that they abused their children. Same goes for the vast majority of other cases. Of those 36 convictions, 34 were overturned by the mid-2000s, and the 2 people that weren't had passed away while still in prison. The whole incident was just another example of public panic meeting an opportunist. In this case, that role was filled by DA Ed Jagels.
Under Jagels, police and social workers didn't just follow up on accusations of molestation. They sought them out like desperate salespeople working on commission. Investigators drove children around and asked them to point out the bad people. They whisked kids away from their parents in the middle of the night without explanation, deprived them of sleep, and interrogated them like prisoners of war, feeding them scenarios of sexual abuse until they broke down and confessed.
But Kern County was merely the Outback Steakhouse Bloomin' Onion in this feast of hysteria. One small-town scandal does not a national frenzy make. What followed was a veritable buffet of accusations, particularly targeting daycares, which follows given the era's parental guilt over leaving their kids with strangers while they went to work. Oak Hill, Fells Acres, Country Walk, Little Rascals Daycare Incident, which I'm sorry, that name just sounds so innocent, and I know it's not, but come on. And who could forget the McMartin preschool trials? Doubtless the most infamous of the daycare abuse scandals, McMartin captivated the nation with its wild accusations and outlandish numbers. A 7-year-long case, the most expensive series of trials in American history, $15 million, $41 million adjusted for inflation, over 360 children among the purported victims, and in the end, the most embarrassing number of all, 0 convictions. Not all that surprising given how during the initial investigation, a letter was sent to 200 parents of McMartin preschool children, asking them to, quote, "Please question your child to see if he or she has been a witness to any crime or if he or she has been a victim." It then goes on to list the bodily areas that their child may have been abused, putting the ideas in their minds before even asking the question. Now, stop for a moment and just try to put yourself in the shoes of the parent who got this letter. They probably just picked their kid up from daycare after a long day at work, ready to get home and have meatloaf and mashed potatoes, when they open up their mailbox and see a letter from the police department addressed to them. Imagine the dread that sets in as they read those words, those descriptions of things happening to children, maybe even their children. How would they react? How would you?
I think people have to know what happened here. I think people in the world need to know this was a witch hunt, that nothing happened at the school, and it could happen to anyone. Because it can, and it has been. It's happening all over the country. Because of this case, it has happened everywhere.
Of course, it started a witch hunt. Literally. It was a failure at every level. The care workers for jumping at shadows after their seminar, the police for generating confessions from whole cloth, the judge and prosecutor, and everyone else for not seeing this as the fantastical farce that it was. Now, we've only been discussing the US, but the panic didn't respect borders. Though, to be fair, it was birthed outside them with Michelle Remembers anyways. Canada had its own mess in Martinsville, Saskatchewan, and just scrolling down the wiki shows how far the panic actually spread, including countries as geographically disparate as Australia, Italy, South Africa, Brazil, and many others.
It's not a witch hunt anyway.
We must all ask ourselves if we have created an environment where victims are rewarded, listened to, comforted, and forgiven in direct proportion to the severity of their abuse. Are we encouraging needy or traumatized individuals to tell more and more outrageous tales of their victimization? Are we making up for centuries of denial by now blindly accepting any allegation of child abuse, no matter how absurd or unlikely? The overreaction to the problem can be worse than the problem.
The single biggest lie about the Satanic Panic is that it ended in the mid-90s, as if America collectively got together and just decided on a détente. Throughout the decade, America had to face a really uncomfortable truth as it became clearer and clearer that none of these SRA cases were going anywhere. The truth is that in the vast majority of kidnappings, violence, and sexual assault cases against children, the perpetrator is someone they know, family or friends, not a stranger. Longlegs' present day is in the early 90s, which we can see from the hilariously on-the-nose photo of Bill Clinton above Lee's boss's desk, along with the everything else about the movie. They too are having to come to grips with this truth. Longlegs, the character, is exactly the sort of person that would have been pointed out as a danger during the panic. The long hair, the glam rock, the facial deformity. However, if we take him as the surrogate father figure in Lee's life, then it also completely fits that he is her abuser and her mother the enabler. As Oz Perkins himself said, it's this secret that she's keeping to ostensibly protect her daughter, but we know that it's doing the opposite. It's also allowing Longlegs the resources and opportunity to prey on other victims. It's a reflection of the real world and how abusers often manipulate other family members to avert their eyes or even enable the abuse. Likewise, though Longlegs is manipulating the families through devil magic, the person that actually pulls the trigger is always the father. The FBI's assumption that the killer must be an outsider, despite all the evidence to the contrary, except for the letters, is a critique of societal tendencies to overlook the more obvious in favor of sensational explanations. This mirrors the real-world phenomenon where during periods of moral panic, society often focuses on external threats while ignoring the more insidious dangers within. The film uses this to comment on how, during the Satanic Panic of the 80s, America was preoccupied with chasing imagined threats, while real abusers continued their activities unchecked. The 90s being the setting here is important, because it was at that time that these statistics emerged and became more widely known and accepted. Yet Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither did the Satanic Panic go away in a single night. While it's true that the stance of the federal government had shifted by the early 90s, especially after exhaustive meta-studies like the ones by Dr. Goodman and Kenneth Lanning, definitively stated that outside a few isolated cases with individuals, there had never been any proof of such a thing. That doesn't address the fact that at a smaller level, people were still being accused and put on trial for supposed SRA. There were high-profile cases publicized and tried both during and after these reports were made public, including the infamous West Memphis 3, in which 3 teenage boys were accused of kidnapping, sexually assaulting, and murdering 3 8-year-old boys in 1993. The boys were suspected primarily because the investigating officers had a hunch that they were into the occult, which is just another way of saying that they were goth and weird, so of course that means they worship Satan. It was only in 2010, when DNA evidence proved that the three had nothing to do with the crime, that the once teenagers, now middle-aged men, were released from prison. Even later, in 1997, was the case of the San Antonio Four, which mirrored the case from West Memphis years before. Here, accusations of ritualistic child molestation were fueled by homophobia, aimed at 4 lesbian women. They were exonerated in 2015 after spending 15 years in prison. No matter which way you look at it, the panic just didn't end in the early 90s. Hell, there was a case in Italy as recent as 2007 where the prosecutor successfully convicted a woman by invoking satanic ritual abuse. You can't set the nation, the world, on fire with words like child abuse and Satanism, let it spread and grow for over a decade, and then just expect it to fizzle out. Not even with exhaustive official reports, not even when government experts come out against it. That's just not how conspiracy theories work. Instead, through cultural osmosis, the fervor moved into our media and our subconscious biases. All of these conceptions of the occult, now well-worn tropes, are visible in many contemporary movies. I even did a video about a recent example, Hereditary. But just in the last 10 years, there are plenty more examples, like The Nun, Late Night with the Devil, Last Shift, The Invitation, Death of Me, and now Longlegs. I love horror as much as the next person. It's again why I made the video about Hereditary, why I became interested in making this. The problem doesn't lie in the depictions of these things, as long as they aren't relying on harmful stereotypes, but instead arise when audiences lack the media literacy to distinguish sensationalized imagery from reality. Consciously or subconsciously, they leave the door open to fear, in this case of widespread satanic cults, fear of their neighbors, people they've known for years.
Fuck.
In the case of the Satanic Panic, what started with a hokey memoir ended with real people spending years in jail for crimes they didn't commit. By far, though, the worst outcome of the panic was the harm it caused to actual victims of abuse. Several states adopted laws that made satanic ritual abuse more heavily prosecuted and thus more investigated than anything that didn't have the devil in the details, if you will. Those cases got more media attention because of the melodrama of a good versus evil battle. As Dr. Goodman notes in her report's conclusion,
lay and professional worries about children being abused in ungodly ritualistic ways have resulted in new legislation in several states that makes satanic or ritualistic abuse punishable more severely than abuse that does not have anti-religious connotations. Our research leads us to believe that there are many more children being abused in the name of God than in the name of Satan. Ironically, while the public concerns itself with passing laws to punish satanic child abuse, laws already exist that protect parents whose particular variants of belief in God deny their children life-saving medical care.
People had the scions of a demon to occupy their fears and suspicions, and they completely missed the religious heads abusing children right under their noses. Now you might be saying, David, this is ridiculous. Nobody is going to mistake a fictional movie for something real. Well, viewer, ultimately, as it was stated at the top, the majority of the occult was adopted directly from existing pagan traditions that the early church thought too dangerous. Some, including the ideas of circles of hell, were either cemented in the mainstream or originated entirely from Dante's Commedia, itself written almost 1,000 years later. Like, do me a favor and close your eyes. Imagine the devil, Lucifer Morningstar, Beelzebub, the adversary. Picture him standing there in whatever manner your mind first conjures. Got it? Did he appear as a red, goat-legged, bat-winged humanoid with possibly a tail and a slithering snake tongue? Like this? Well, I hate to break it to you, but if your image was at all similar, then you have been influenced by media. A few hundred years and change after Dante, popular media was using that image, the red-horned devil reigning over his lake of fire, everywhere. Movies, cartoons, book covers, advertisements, etc. And whether or not you actually believe that Satan truly exists, there are still many people that do, who would also likely come up with a similar image. That is the power that books, movies, and TV can have over us, whether we realize it or not. It happened in 1938 with Orson Welles. It happened in the 70s and 80s with Michelle Remembers, and it happened again in 2016 and 2020 with Pizzagate and QAnon. It will happen again.
There appears to be tangible evidence which suggests that there is a pedophile ring in and around Washington, D.C. that includes potentially some of the most powerful people in our government.
If you were lucky enough to miss the conspiracy that swept MAGA Nation during Trump's first election cycle, Pizzagate, I'll sum it up briefly. Basically, a white supremacist Twitter account pretending to be a Jewish person posted a false claim in October 2016 saying that the NYPD had uncovered a secret pedophilia ring with Hillary Clinton at the center. Convoluted, I know. The name came from the crux of the conspiracy, namely that the sex-trafficked children were being auctioned out of a basement of a pizzeria in Washington, D.C., a basement which does not exist.
Here is a photo showing the inside of Comet Ping Pong where graffiti saying "shut up and fuck" and "amen" are clearly visible.
There were a ton of problems with the theory right out of the gate. First off, the internet decoders picked the pizzeria, Comet Ping Pong, because they thought the logo looked similar to satanic symbols. And that was basically as deep as the evidence went. Apparent clues that the perpetrators left behind to... Why were we leaving those behind?
Here he references a boom boom room, which sounds disturbingly like a play on the phrase boom boom used by foreign prostitutes to describe sex.
It never made much sense, but then again, neither did any of the daycare claims of the 80s. Just like those times, the world was in a state of societal change and upheaval of the old ways. Back then, it was women going into the workforce, AIDS, and serial killers. In the 2010s, it was the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, and the push to mainstream LGBTQ issues for more visibility. Evidence was secondary. People were scared of change, and they lashed out with bizarre and often contradictory theories. But, of course, the human equivalent of the coagulated grease stain on the inside of your Domino's box won the election that year, and Pizzagate was adopted into the big tent conspiracy, QAnon, in 2020 because he fostered those types of ideas. The one conspiracy to rule them all started with an anonymous figure, Q, who claimed to have top-secret government clearance and who began posting cryptic messages online in 2017, at first to 4chan and then later to 8chan, now 8kun, once they deemed 4chan put too much of a limit on free speech. 4chan. Right. Anyways, the theory assimilated Pizzagate and other conspiracies, like the Flat Earth. A secret cabal of Satan-worshipping pedophiles, including high-profile politicians, business moguls, and celebrities, were all supposedly running a global child sex trafficking ring.
Democrats are a satanic pedophile ring, and that you are the savior of that.
But I know nothing about it.
They believe it is a satanic cult run by the deep state.
If the whole thing sounds incredibly convoluted, it isn't. Pizzagate was convoluted. This is just a mess. Q's posts filled with vague hints and riddles were decoded and expanded upon by online communities, turning this into a sprawling homunculus of conspiracy theories. The evidence was always laughably thin, from numerology to messages coded into tweets, to linking timecodes between posts. It's like they thought the villains, these supposed sly masterminds who managed to infiltrate the government and run the world from the shadows for years without ever being truly caught, just left clues for them to find for funsies. Despite being debunked multiple times, QAnon gained traction during COVID. In an eerie echo to the Satanic Panic from decades before, these people, so scared of change and upheaval, found comfort in the thought that everything is run by devil worshippers. Better than knowing that, unfortunately, nobody's at the wheel. The world is just chaos. In my own town, there was a large group of Q believers in late 2021 who gathered in anticipation of JFK Jr.'s supposed reemergence. Some of them even believed that JFK himself rose from the grave after his assassination in 1963 and had been our secret messiah for all these years. They thought that his son would become Trump's VP as they retook the White House and drained the swamp once and for all. For those not in the know, JFK Jr. is and has been dead for years. That didn't stop these people who holed up in a Dallas hotel for weeks, racking up massive amounts of debt, severing family relations, and basically ruining their lives. But other than that last gasp, the movement has mostly gone quiet since January 6th, and Q, whoever they are, has been silent for years. Yet it still lives on. Trump still tweets about it, truths about it, whatever you call it. The believers, the ones who weren't chewed up and spit out by the movement already, haven't gone anywhere. There are still 2 pro-Q congresspeople holding office, as well as many others who, while they don't say the naughty word, do tacitly endorse the ideas. Q is still around. The branding has simply shifted. In the aftermath of QAnon's fall from public consciousness, the remnants of its ideology have seeped into various corners of society, morphing and adapting to new narratives. The fervor may have dimmed, but the embers still glow, ready to ignite at the slightest provocation. The internet, with its vast and unregulated expanse, continues to be a fertile ground for the ideas to take root and spread. Social media platforms, despite efforts to curb misinformation, always find themselves playing catch-up to the ever-evolving tactics of conspiracy theorists. The real danger lies in the normalization of such extreme beliefs. When conspiracy theories become mainstream, they erode trust in institutions and fracture communities. The lines between reality and fiction blur, creating a landscape where facts are malleable and truth is subjective. This erosion of trust is not just a societal issue, but a threat to democracy itself. When people lose faith in the electoral process, the media, and the rule of law, the very foundations of a democratic society are at risk. This phenomenon isn't new. The Satanic Panic of the 1980s serves both as historical parallel and progenitor, where fear and misinformation led to widespread hysteria. Just as QAnon believers saw hidden messages in grand conspiracies, people during the Satanic Panic were convinced that a network of Satan-worshipping cults was preying on children. The lack of concrete evidence didn't deter the believers in either case. Instead, it fueled their conviction. The 2 periods of hysteria highlight a recurring pattern. In times of social upheaval, people often turn to conspiracy theories to make sense of their fears. No matter how fantastical, contradictory, counterfactual, or convoluted, the idea of control, even by a devil-worshipping cabal of untouchable world leaders, is apparently more appealing to some than the alternative. Longlegs taps into this very fear. The movie giddily harkens back, pun intended, to that area where Satanic Panic was still fresh in the public's mind. Its story could have been ripped straight from the supposed recovered memories of Michelle Smith herself, matching note for note much of the imagery and themes prevalent during the panic. Yet, despite its brilliance, it's ultimately one more on the list of movies about satanic abuse and murder, one more that uses the same imagery and tropes. It's a chilling reminder of how deeply embedded the fear of Satanism and satanic cults are in our cultural memory.
I am done. But I won't only be in here. I'll be a little bit of everywhere.
The question then becomes, what's next? The accusation of devil worship has always been used as a means to oppress those on the fringes of society, whether it was the Jews and their supposed blood libel, the Romani during the Spanish Inquisition, or the LGBTQ community in the 70s and 80s. It's a banner that can be hoisted by those in power to signal to their followers that a wolf is in the sheep's pen. Be wary. Now, the conservatives have once again flared up the racial tensions in America, turning a real issue of immigration logistics into racism-fueled fear. We have a presidential candidate accusing Haitians of eating cats and dogs in a nationally televised debate. Just like the fear of Satanism, this accusation has historically been aimed at Caribbean immigrants due to fears of voodoo. To many on the far right, those 2 concepts are synonymous. It's only a matter of time before the term devil worship starts being thrown around. Once again, the old fears are being revived to demonize a minority group. Looking ahead, it's crucial to foster critical thinking and media literacy, especially among younger generations. We need to be clear that movies are movies, TV is TV, Michelle needs to forget, and the only widespread satanic groups in America are either edgy libertarians or spicy atheists. Education systems need to adapt, teaching students not to consume information mindlessly, but to question and analyze it. only by addressing the root causes of fear and uncertainty can we hope to prevent the next wave of conspiracy theories from taking hold. The battle for truth is ongoing, and it requires vigilance, empathy, and a commitment to the principles of a free and open society.